In the autumn of 1879, when promises were still kept with handshakes and love was measured in miles walked rather than words spoken, a young woman set out on a journey that would become legend in the hills of Appalachia. She had a twisted foot that had pained her since birth, a wedding dress folded in a canvas sack, and 60 miles of rough mountain trail between her and the man waiting at the altar. The mountains didn't care about her limp, and neither did the stones that cut through her worn boots. But she walked anyway, because some things are worth every agonizing step. What happened on that long road would prove that the truest measure of love isn't found in perfection, but in the willingness to carry each other when the path grows too steep to walk alone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of Angeline May Hartwell decided to walk to her own wedding. The sky hung low and grey over the Tennessee hills, like an old wool blanket somebody forgot to shake out. She stood in the doorway of the only home she'd ever known, a timber cabin her father had built with his own hands before the fever took him, and she looked out at the winding dirt road that disappeared into the forest. Her mother had been gone 3 years now, buried beside her father under the twin oaks on the hill, and the cabin felt more like a memory than a home. Evangeline was 22 years old, born with a clubfoot that turned inward, and made every step a careful negotiation between determination and pain. The local doctor, when she was just a baby, had told her mother she'd likely never walk at all, but Evangeline's mother had been a stubborn woman, the kind who believed willpower could reshape bone, and she'd spent years massaging that tiny, twisted foot, fashioning special boots, teaching her daughter to distribute her weight just so. Evangeline walked, not gracefully, not without pain, but she walked. In the small mountain community of Birchwood Hollow where she'd grown up, folks had learned not to pity Evangeline Hartwell. She'd never asked for special treatment, never used her limp as an excuse. She'd learned to sew straighter seams than any woman in 3 counties, could gut a fish faster than most men, and had a voice that could carry a hymn clear across the valley on Sunday mornings. She'd also learned to read people's eyes, to see the difference between kindness and pity, between love and charity. Thomas Benjamin Ashford had eyes that held no pity. She'd met him 2 years earlier at the Autumn Harvest Festival in the neighboring town of Millstone Ridge, a full day's wagon ride from Birchwood Hollow. Thomas had been visiting his uncle, helping with the mill, and he'd asked Evangeline to dance, not out of politeness, not because someone had nudged him toward the girl sitting alone, but because he'd heard her laughing at something her friend had said, and wanted to know what could make someone laugh like that. Like joy was something that lived in her bones. When she'd hesitated, glancing down at her foot, he'd simply offered his hand and said he wasn't much of a dancer himself, so they'd be well matched. They'd moved slowly around the edge of the barn floor while the fiddle played, and he'd never once looked down at her limp. He'd looked at her face, asked her questions, listened to her answers like they mattered. After that night, letters began to arrive. Long letters, written in careful script, telling her about his work at the sawmill in Copper Falls, about the mountains he could see from his window, about the house he was building with lumber he'd cut and planed himself. He wrote about wanting a life that meant something, about the kind of home where children would grow up loved and safe, about how he couldn't stop thinking about the woman with the laugh that sounded like music. Evangeline wrote back. She told him about her garden, about the books she borrowed from the traveling library, about her dreams of having a family, about her fears that no man would want a wife who couldn't dance properly or walk without pain. Thomas's next letter had been shorter than usual, just 2 lines that she'd memorized. I don't want a wife who can dance. I want a wife who knows how to hold joy even when life is hard. That's you, Evangeline. 6 months ago, he'd asked her to marry him, not in a letter, but in person, having traveled the full 30 miles from Copper Falls to Birchwood Hollow on foot because his horse had thrown a shoe. He'd arrived dusty and tired, but his eyes had been bright, and he'd knelt right there in her garden between the tomato plants and the bean poles. She'd said yes before he'd finished asking. They'd planned the wedding for October, after the harvest, when the leaves turned gold and the air grew crisp. Thomas had wanted to come fetch her properly, but circumstances had shifted like mountain weather. His younger brother had taken ill with pneumonia, and Thomas couldn't leave him. The local minister in Copper Falls could only perform the ceremony on one particular Saturday, when he'd be passing through on his circuit. Everything had to happen quickly or wait another 6 months. The plan had been simple. Evangeline's neighbor, Mr. Dobson, would take her in his wagon. It was a 2-day journey with an overnight stop at a traveler's inn halfway between the towns. But 3 days before they were set to leave, Mr. Dobson's mare had broken her leg in a groundhog hole and had to be put down. He had no other horse, no way to make the journey. Evangeline had sat in her cabin that night, staring at the wedding dress she'd been sewing for months. It was simple, made from cream-colored muslin she'd traded eggs and preserves for, with tiny buttons she'd carved from bone and polished until they shone. She'd embroidered wildflowers along the hem, each stitch placed with hope. The dress hung on the wall like a promise, and she couldn't bear to send word that she wouldn't come. That's when she decided to walk 60 miles through mountain territory, with a foot that ached after just walking to the spring house and back. Folks in Birchwood Hollow thought she'd lost her mind when she told them. Mrs. Calloway, the postmaster's wife, had actually grabbed her by the shoulders and asked if the loneliness had finally addled her brain. Even young Rachel Porter, who usually supported Evangeline in everything, had begged her to wait, to send word to Thomas, to postpone. But Evangeline had made up her mind with the same stubborn determination her mother had used to teach her to walk in the first place. She would leave before dawn, walk as far as she could each day, sleep rough if she had to, and arrive in Copper Falls in time for the wedding. She had her mother's old traveling cloak, a bedroll, a satchel with dried meat and hardtack, a canteen, and her father's hunting knife. She had the dress wrapped carefully in oilcloth, and she had something Thomas had sent her months ago, a simple compass with their initials scratched into the brass casing. The night before she left, Evangeline sat alone in the cabin and wrote a letter to Thomas. She didn't tell him she was walking, didn't want him to worry or try to stop her. She simply wrote that she was coming, that nothing would keep her from him, and that she'd see him at the church. She gave the letter to Rachel to post, made her promise not to tell anyone about the walking until after she'd been gone a full day. She slept fitfully that last night, waking every few hours to check the sky through the window. When the first grey light began to seep over the mountains, she rose and dressed in her sturdiest clothes. A brown wool skirt, a cotton blouse, thick stockings, and the special boots her mother had made. Reinforced now with leather patches, Evangeline had added herself. She braided her dark hair tightly, pinned it up, and covered it with a simple bonnet. She walked through the cabin one last time, touching the table where her family had eaten thousands of meals, the mantel where her father's pipe still sat, the rocking chair her mother had nursed her in. She wasn't sure when she'd return, or if the cabin would still be standing when she did. Life in these mountains was uncertain, and homes left empty often fell to weather or wanderers. But Thomas was in Copper Falls, and that's where her future lived. She stepped outside into the cold dawn, shouldered her pack, adjusted the canvas satchel with the dress, and looked down the road. The first few miles would be easy, relatively flat, following the creek bed through familiar territory. After that, the road would climb into the high country, wind through forests she'd never seen, cross streams she'd only heard about. Somewhere beyond those mountains, Thomas was waiting. Evangeline took her first step, feeling the familiar twist of pain in her left foot, the way her weight had to shift to compensate. She took a second step, then a third. She didn't look back at the cabin. Looking back had never been her way. The early miles passed in a rhythm she knew well. Step, shift, step, breathe through the ache, step again. Her foot throbbed even before the sun had fully risen, but she'd learned long ago to make friends with pain, to acknowledge it without letting it stop her. She passed the Calloway farm, saw smoke rising from their chimney but didn't stop. She passed the old grist mill, long abandoned, its wheel frozen in place, moss growing thick on the paddles. By mid-morning she'd covered nearly 5 miles and reached the edge of territory she knew well. The road narrowed here, becoming more of a trail, winding upward into thicker forest. The autumn leaves created a canopy of gold and crimson overhead, and the air smelled of earth and decay and the promise of winter coming. She stopped at a small creek to rest and refill her canteen. Her foot was screaming now, and she unlaced her boot carefully, examining the skin. Already a blister was forming on her heel, and the old calluses on her sole had begun to crack. She soaked her foot in the cold water, gritting her teeth against the shock of it, then dried it carefully and wrapped it with strips of cloth she'd brought for this purpose. This was only the beginning. She had 55 miles left to go. But Evangeline Hartwell had never been afraid of long roads or hard paths. She laced her boot back up, took a drink of cold water, and stood. The pain was white-hot for a moment, then settled into the familiar burning throb. She started walking again. The trail climbed steadily through the afternoon. She passed wild berry bushes heavy with fruit, their branches bending low. She passed a family of deer who watched her with liquid eyes before bounding away into the undergrowth. She passed beneath oak trees so old their trunks were wider than her cabin, their roots creating natural steps in the steep sections of trail. She walked until the sun began to sink behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She'd covered perhaps 12 miles, maybe 13. Her entire body ached, but it was her foot that demanded attention, pulsing with each heartbeat, swollen inside the boot. She found a small clearing just off the trail, sheltered by a rock outcropping that would provide some protection if rain came. She gathered fallen branches, built a small fire with the flint and steel from her pack, and heated water for tea made from dried mint leaves. She ate a piece of hardtack and some dried venison, chewing slowly, making it last. As darkness settled fully over the mountains, Evangeline rolled out her bedding near the fire and lay down, still wearing her boots, because she was afraid if she took them off, she wouldn't be able to get them back on in the morning. Above her, through the branches, stars began to appear, more stars than she'd ever seen from Birchwood Hollow. She thought about Thomas, wondered if he was looking at the same stars, wondered if he had any idea that she was out here in the wilderness, walking toward him through the dark. She touched the compass in her pocket, felt the cool brass against her fingers, and whispered into the night, "I'm coming, I promise I'm coming." Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the sounds of the forest, by the cold seeping through her blanket, by the relentless aching of her foot. But when dawn broke grey and misty over the mountains, Evangeline rose, dampened her fire, shouldered her pack, and began to walk again. The second day was harder than the first. Her foot had stiffened overnight, and the first steps were agony. She had to stop after just a few hundred yards to adjust her boot, to rewrap the cloth bandaging, to breathe through tears that had nothing to do with sadness and everything to do with pain. But she walked, through morning mist that clung to the valleys like spilled milk, through afternoon heat that made her wool skirt feel like it weighed 100 pounds, through evening light that turned the world golden and soft. She met a trader on the road that afternoon, a weathered man with a mule loaded down with furs. He tipped his hat, asked where she was headed, looked skeptical when she said Copper Falls. "That's a far piece for a lady alone," he'd said, "especially one who's limping as bad as you are." "I'll get there," Evangeline had replied, and something in her voice must have convinced him not to argue. That night she slept in a lean-to shelter someone had built beside the trail, evidence that others had traveled this path before her. She was 25 miles from home now, maybe more, and her foot had developed new blisters on top of the old ones. When she finally removed her boot, she found blood soaked through the cloth wrapping. She cleaned the wounds as best she could with water from a nearby spring, applied a poultice made from yarrow and plantain leaves she'd gathered along the trail, and rewrapped everything with fresh cloth. She knew she couldn't keep this pace. She knew her foot might give out entirely before she reached Copper Falls. But she also knew that Thomas was 35 miles away and getting closer with every painful step. On the third day, she descended into a valley where a small settlement clustered around a crossroads. Just a few buildings, a general store, a blacksmith, a church with a crooked steeple. She bought more hardtack and dried apples with the few coins she had, refilled her canteen from the town well, and kept walking. A woman sweeping the porch of the general store called out, "You need a place to rest, honey? You look about done in." Evangeline smiled, shook her head. "I need to keep moving, but thank you kindly." The miles blurred together. Forests gave way to meadows, meadows to more forests. The trail crossed and recrossed a river that sang over stones. She saw a black bear in the distance once, foraging for late-season berries, and she gave it a wide berth. She saw hawks circling overhead, their cries sharp and wild. Her foot stopped hurting somewhere around the 40th mile, not because it had healed, but because the pain had become so constant, so all-encompassing, that it simply became part of her, like breathing or heartbeat. She walked in a kind of trance, counting steps, watching the trail, thinking about Thomas's hands, and the way he'd looked at her that first night when they danced. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. She was going to marry him. She was going to stand in that church in Copper Falls, and she was going to say yes to a life together. And nothing, not mountains or pain or impossible distances, was going to stop her. On the 5th day, when the sun was high and hot despite the autumn chill, when her canteen was nearly empty and her provisions were down to a handful of dried apples, when every step felt like walking on broken glass, Evangeline crested a ridge and saw it in the distance. Copper Falls. The town spread out in a valley below, buildings clustered around a river, smoke rising from chimneys, church steeple pointing skyward. She could see the sawmill on the edge of town, the great wheel turning in the current. Somewhere down there, Thomas was working, living his life, waiting for a bride he thought was coming by wagon. She had walked 50 miles, just 10 more to go. Evangeline sat down right there on the ridge, not because she was tired, though she was exhausted beyond measure, but because she needed to see it, needed to let the sight of her destination fill her up with enough hope to carry her the rest of the way. The sun was starting to sink. She wouldn't make it before dark, but she'd make it. Tomorrow, maybe the next day, she would walk down into that valley, find the church, find Thomas, and she would marry the man who'd asked her, not in spite of her limp, but without even considering it a thing worth noting. She stood again, ignoring the white fire in her foot, the trembling in her legs, the lightness in her head from too little food and too much walking. She took one step forward, then another. 10 miles. She'd walked 50. What was 10 more? As the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold, Evangeline May Hartwell began her final descent toward Copper Falls, toward love, toward a future she'd literally walked into the mountains to claim. The descent into the valley should have been easier than climbing, but Evangeline discovered quickly that going downhill was its own special torture. Every step jarred her foot, sending shockwaves up through her ankle and calf. The muscles in her legs, already exhausted from 50 miles of walking, now had to work twice as hard to control her descent to keep her from pitching forward on the steep sections of trail. Darkness fell before she'd made it even halfway down, and she had no choice but to stop. She found a spot beneath a massive pine tree, its branches creating a natural shelter, and made camp for what she hoped would be her last night on the trail. Her hands shook as she tried to start a fire, the flint slipping from her fingers twice before she managed to strike a spark. She had 3 dried apples left and a piece of hardtack so stale she had to soak it in water to make it soft enough to chew. Her canteen was nearly empty, but more concerning than hunger or thirst was her foot. When she finally unlaced her boot and peeled away the blood-stiffened cloth wrapping, she found wounds that had gone beyond blisters. The skin was raw and weeping, infected in places, swollen to nearly twice its normal size. She cleaned it as best she could with the last of her water, applied fresh poultice, but she knew this foot wasn't going to carry her much further. She'd pushed too hard, walked too far. The club foot that had always been weak, always been vulnerable, had finally reached its limit. Evangeline lay awake most of that night, staring up through the pine branches at stars that seemed impossibly distant. She was so close now, just a few more miles. She could see the lights of Copper Falls twinkling in the valley below like fallen stars. Somewhere down there, Thomas was sleeping, perhaps dreaming about tomorrow or the next day when his bride would arrive. He didn't know she was here, broken and bleeding on a mountainside. He didn't know she'd walked 50 miles to reach him. Part of her wished she'd told him in that last letter, wished he knew what she was willing to endure. But another part of her, the proud, stubborn part that had kept her walking when every instinct screamed to stop, didn't want him to know, didn't want him to see her like this, destroyed by the very journey she'd undertaken for love. When dawn came, cold and grey with the promise of rain, Evangeline tried to stand. Her foot wouldn't bear weight. She tried again, gripping the tree trunk for support, and managed to get upright. But the moment she tried to take a step, her leg buckled beneath her. She sat back down hard, breathing through the wave of panic that threatened to swamp her. She was less than 10 miles from Copper Falls, less than 10 miles from Thomas, from the church, from the life she'd walked across mountains to claim. And her body had finally, completely given out. For the first time since she'd left Birchwood Hollow 6 days ago, Evangeline cried. Not the quiet tears she'd shed from pain during the long miles, but deep wrenching sobs that came from somewhere ancient and frightened inside her. She cried for her mother who wasn't here to tell her what to do, for her father who'd always made her feel like she could do anything despite her foot, for herself and the impossible choice she now faced. She could stay here and hope someone came along the trail, but this path wasn't heavily traveled. It might be days before anyone passed. She could try to crawl, but 10 miles was an impossible distance on hands and knees. Or she could somehow, impossibly, force herself to walk. The rain started mid-morning, light at first, then steady. Evangeline sat beneath the pine tree, wrapped in her mother's cloak, and watched the valley below disappear behind sheets of grey. The wedding was supposed to happen tomorrow. Thomas would be at the church, would wait for a bride who wasn't coming. He'd think she'd changed her mind, think she'd decided he wasn't worth the journey after all. That thought, more than the pain or the rain or the exhaustion, got her moving. She fashioned a crude crutch from a fallen branch, using her knife to strip away the smaller twigs and shape it to fit under her arm. She wrapped the canvas satchel containing her wedding dress more securely in the oilcloth, tied it to her back. She left behind everything else she could spare, the bedroll, the empty canteen, anything that added weight. Then Evangeline May Hartwell, who'd walked 50 miles on a clubfoot that was never meant to carry her this far, began to hobble down the mountain toward Copper Falls. The crutch helped, but not much. The branch was rough and dug into her armpit with every step. Her good foot slipped on wet leaves and mud. Rain dripped from her bonnet, soaked through her cloak, turned the trail into a treacherous stream of running water and loose stones. She fell twice in the first hour. The second time, she landed hard on her already injured foot, and the pain was so intense she vomited into the wet leaves beside the trail. She lay there in the rain and the mud, tasting bile and defeat, and seriously considered just staying there, just letting the rain wash over her until someone found her or didn't. But then she thought about Thomas's letters, all those careful words about building a life together. She thought about his hands offering her a dance when no one else would. She thought about the house he'd built with his own labor, the future he'd imagined that included her. She pushed herself up. She found her crutch. She kept moving. The miles passed in a blur of agony. She lost track of time, of distance, of everything except the need to put one foot in front of the other, to keep the valley below from disappearing entirely into the rain and mist. At some point, the trail leveled out, and she realized she'd reached the valley floor. The town was closer now, maybe 3 miles, maybe 4. Her vision started to blur around the edges. She couldn't tell if it was from exhaustion or pain, or the rain that kept pouring down. She stumbled more frequently, catching herself on trees, on rocks, barely staying upright. The road widened, became more defined. She passed a fence line, then another. Signs of civilization, of the town she'd been walking toward for 6 endless days. She could smell wood smoke now, could hear the distant sound of the sawmill. She was going to make it, broken and bleeding and barely able to stand, but she was going to make it. That's when she heard the horse, hoofbeats behind her, coming fast. She moved to the side of the road, leaning heavily on her crutch, and turned to see a rider approaching through the rain. As he drew closer, she recognized the horse, a big grey gelding that belonged to the Reverend Peters, the circuit preacher who was supposed to perform the wedding ceremony. The Reverend pulled up beside her, his face showing shock and concern. "Dear Lord, child, what are you doing out here?" Evangeline tried to answer, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. She tried again. "Going to Copper Falls, to the church, getting married tomorrow." The Reverend dismounted quickly, taking in her condition with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen plenty of suffering in these mountains. "You can't walk another step. You need a doctor." "Need to get to the church," Evangeline insisted, swaying on her feet. "Thomas Ashford. He's waiting." Recognition flashed across the Reverend's face. "You're Thomas's bride, the one coming from Birchwood Hollow?" He looked around as if expecting to see a wagon. "Where's your escort? How did you get here?" "Walked," Evangeline said simply. The Reverend stared at her like she'd spoken in a foreign tongue. "You walked? From Birchwood Hollow? That's 60 miles through mountain country." 50 so far, Evangeline corrected. Then her legs finally gave out completely. The Reverend caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her gently to sit against a fence post. "We need to get you to town, get you dry and warm and tended to. I'll ride ahead, send back a wagon." "No," Evangeline said, gripping his sleeve with surprising strength. "No wagon. Thomas can't see me like this, can't know I walked. Please. Child, he needs to know. He's been worried sick. Your letter said you were coming, but that was over a week ago. He's been expecting you any day." Evangeline's heart clenched. She'd caused him worry on top of everything else. "What day is it?" "Saturday. The wedding was supposed to be this afternoon, but when you didn't arrive, we postponed it until tomorrow, thinking maybe the weather delayed your wagon." This afternoon, she'd missed it by hours. She looked down at herself, at the mud-caked skirt, the ruined boots, the swollen, infected foot she could barely feel anymore. She looked at the satchel on her back containing the dress she'd sewn with such hope, now probably as soaked and ruined as the rest of her. "I can't go to him like this," she whispered. "I can't let him see what this journey did to me." The Reverend's expression softened with understanding, and something that might have been admiration. "Miss Hartwell, if that man loves you the way I suspect he does, seeing you like this won't change a thing, except maybe make him love you more for what you were, willing to endure." But Evangeline shook her head, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. "You don't understand. All my life, people have looked at me with pity because of my foot. They see the limp before they see me. Thomas never did that. He saw me as whole, as capable. If he sees me now, broken and helpless, carried into town like some wounded animal, that's all he'll ever see. That's all I'll ever be to him. I think you underestimate him," the Reverend said gently. "Maybe," Evangeline admitted, "but I've walked 50 miles to marry him as an equal, not as someone who needs rescuing. I just need a few hours to clean up, to rest. Then I can walk the rest of the way. I can meet him at the church like I planned." The Reverend looked at her foot, at the way she couldn't put any weight on it, at the fever flush in her cheeks that suggested infection had set in. He was clearly torn between getting her immediate medical attention and respecting her wishes. Finally, he sighed. "There's an inn about a mile up the road. Can you make it that far if I walk the horse beside you? Let you lean on me?" Evangeline nodded, though she wasn't sure she could make it another 10 feet, let alone a mile. The Reverend helped her up, steadying her with one arm while leading his horse with the other. They moved slowly through the rain, Evangeline using both her crude crutch and the Reverend's support to stay upright. Every step was an act of will. Every breath burned. The inn appeared out of the mist like a mirage, a 2-story building with warm light glowing in the windows. The Reverend helped her inside, explaining to the innkeeper's wife that Miss Hartwell needed a room, a hot bath, and absolute discretion. The woman, Mrs. Fletcher, took one look at Evangeline and immediately began issuing orders to her daughters. Within minutes, Evangeline found herself in a small room upstairs, being helped out of her soaked clothes by gentle hands, lowered into a copper tub filled with hot water that made her wounds scream. Mrs. Fletcher examined her foot with a practiced eye, tisking softly. "This needs proper doctoring, child. You've got an infection setting in deep." "Tomorrow," Evangeline said through chattering teeth. "After the wedding, please." The woman clearly didn't approve, but she cleaned the wounds as best she could, applied a thick salve that smelled of herbs and honey, and wrapped everything in fresh white bandages. She helped Evangeline into a clean nightgown, settled her into the bed, and brought her hot broth and bread. "The Reverend said you walked from Birchwood Hollow," Mrs. Fletcher said, watching Evangeline eat. "That true?" Evangeline nodded. 60 miles with a clubfoot?" "I had to." "For Thomas Ashford?" "Yes." Mrs. Fletcher studied her for a long moment. "I know Thomas. Good man. Works hard, treats folks fair. Lost his parents young, raised his brother himself. He's been talking about you for months, showing everyone your letters like they were made of gold. He's half crazy with worry since you didn't arrive when expected." Evangeline's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to worry him." "No, I suspect you meant to surprise him," Mrs. Fletcher said shrewdly. "And you have, though not perhaps in the way you intended." She paused. "He's downstairs right now, you know." Evangeline's heart stopped. "What?" "Reverend Peters rode ahead. Told him a woman matching your description was coming in from the mountain road, injured and exhausted. Thomas ran the whole way here in the rain. He's down in the common room, dripping wet and demanding to see you." Panic seized Evangeline. She tried to sit up, but her body wouldn't cooperate. "No, please, I can't see him like this. Please don't let him come up." "Why not, child? That man's been counting the days until you arrived." "Because I'm not who he thinks I am," Evangeline said, the words tumbling out in a rush. "He thinks I'm strong and capable and whole. He saw past my limp because I never let it stop me. But look at me now. I couldn't even walk 60 miles without destroying myself. I'm weak and broken, and if he sees me like this, helpless in this bed, that's all he'll ever see. I'll just be the poor crippled girl who couldn't even get to her own wedding without falling apart." Mrs. Fletcher sat down on the edge of the bed, her expression stern. "Now you listen to me, Evangeline Hartwell. You walked 60 miles through mountain country on a foot that most people thought would never carry you at all. You did it alone, in the rain, without complaint or help. You did it for love. That's not a weakness, child. That's the strongest thing I've ever heard of." "But I didn't make it," Evangeline whispered. "I got within a few miles and my body gave out. I failed." "You got within a few miles of making an impossible journey," Mrs. Fletcher corrected. "And you would have crawled the rest of the way if that Reverend hadn't found you? That's not failure." Downstairs, they could hear Thomas's voice, raised in frustration, demanding to know why he couldn't see his bride, insisting that whatever condition she was in didn't matter. "He's not going to stop until he sees you," Mrs. Fletcher said gently. "And honestly, I don't think you should make him wait. But it's your choice." Evangeline closed her eyes. Her whole body ached. Her foot throbbed with a heat that suggested fever. She was in a borrowed nightgown with her hair hanging in damp tangles around her shoulders. This wasn't how she'd imagined their reunion. She'd pictured arriving at the church in her wedding dress, clean and ready, meeting him as an equal. But she'd walked 50 miles, and she was done pretending she could walk the last 10 on her own. "Send him up," she whispered. "But please, give me a moment to at least sit up properly." Mrs. Fletcher helped her arrange herself against the pillows, draped a shawl around her shoulders, and smoothed her hair back from her face. Then she went to the door, opened it, and called down the stairs. "Mr. Ashford, you can come up, but you go gentle. You hear? She's been through an ordeal." Evangeline heard footsteps on the stairs, quick and heavy. Then Thomas was in the doorway, and she saw him clearly for the first time in 6 months. He looked exactly as she remembered, tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and work-roughened hands. But now those eyes were wide with shock and concern, and his face had gone pale beneath its tan. "Evangeline," he breathed, crossing the room in 3 long strides. He knelt beside the bed, reaching for her hand, then seeming to think better of it, afraid to touch her, as if she might break. "What happened? The Reverend said you walked from Birchwood Hollow? That can't be right." "It's right," Evangeline said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Mr. Dobson's horse broke its leg. No one else could take me, so I walked." Thomas stared at her like she'd spoken in riddles. "You walked 60 miles? With your foot?" And there it was, the thing she'd been dreading, the acknowledgement of her weakness, her limitation, the broken part of her she'd hoped he could forget about. "I'm sorry," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I know this wasn't what you expected. I know you wanted a bride who could stand at that altar tomorrow without help, who could dance at the reception, who could walk beside you as a partner, not a burden. I thought I could do it. I thought if I just pushed hard enough, I could be that person for you." Thomas's expression shifted from shock to something else, something Evangeline couldn't quite read. "Stop," he said quietly. "Just stop." He stood, paced to the window, stood there looking out at the rain for a long moment. Evangeline's heart cracked open. This was it. This was the moment he realized he'd made a mistake, that loving someone with a clubfoot was one thing when they were managing it, but another thing entirely when they were broken by it. When he finally turned back to face her, his eyes were bright with tears. "You walked 60 miles, he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You walked 60 miles through mountains and rain, and God knows what else because you wanted to marry me. You destroyed your foot, put yourself through agony, risked everything because you made me a promise and you intended to keep it." He crossed back to the bed, knelt again, and this time he did take her hand, holding it like it was something precious and fragile. "And you think," he continued, "that I would see that as weakness? You think I would look at you, lying here after walking farther than most people could manage with 2 good feet, and see you as less than I thought you were? I couldn't even make it all the way," Evangeline whispered. "I failed. You made it 50 miles on a foot that was never supposed to carry you at all," Thomas said fiercely. "Evangeline, I don't care if you couldn't walk the last 10. I don't care if you never walk another step. Do you understand? I fell in love with who you are, not with what your foot can or can't do. And what you did, this impossible thing, it doesn't make me see you as weak. It makes me wonder what in God's name I ever did to deserve someone who would fight that hard to get to me." Evangeline sobbed, all the fear and pain and exhaustion of the past 6 days pouring out of her. Thomas gathered her carefully into his arms, holding her while she shook, murmuring into her hair that she was safe now, that she was here, that tomorrow they'd still get married if she wanted, or they could wait, whatever she needed. "Tomorrow," Evangeline managed between sobs. "I want to marry you tomorrow." "Then we'll marry tomorrow," Thomas said. "But Evangeline, I need you to promise me something." She pulled back enough to look at him. "What?" "Promise me you'll never walk another step alone," he said. "Promise me that from now on, when the road is hard and your foot hurts, and the distance seems impossible, you'll let me help carry you, because that's what love is. Not 2 people walking separately side by side, but 2 people willing to carry each other when one of them can't walk anymore." Evangeline touched his face, traced the line of his jaw with her thumb. "I promise," she whispered, "but you have to promise me something too. Anything. Promise you'll never see me as broken. Promise you'll always remember that I walked 50 miles to marry you, not that I couldn't walk the last 10. Thomas smiled through his tears. "Evangeline, when I look at you, I don't see broken. I see the strongest woman I've ever known. And tomorrow, when you walk down that aisle toward me, I don't care if you're limping or if I have to carry you every step. All I care about is that you're coming toward me at all." He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent, like a promise being sealed. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the mountains clean. But inside that small room at the inn, 2 people who'd found each other across impossible distances held onto each other and made promises about carrying each other through whatever distance remained. Thomas stayed with Evangeline until Mrs. Fletcher insisted he leave so her patient could rest. He promised to return first thing in the morning, promised the wedding would still happen, promised everything would be all right. But after he left, after the door closed and his footsteps faded down the stairs, Evangeline lay in the darkness and felt the full weight of what she'd done crash down upon her. The euphoria of Thomas's acceptance, his declaration that her journey proved strength rather than weakness, began to fade as reality settled in. Her foot throbbed with a fierce heat that radiated up her leg. When she shifted in the bed, trying to find a position that didn't hurt, she felt the swollen tissue pull against the bandages and had to bite back a cry. Mrs. Fletcher brought her willowbark tea for the pain and the fever that was clearly building, but even after drinking it, sleep wouldn't come. Evangeline stared at the ceiling, listening to the rain drum against the window, and faced the truth she'd been avoiding since she'd fallen on the trail that afternoon. Her foot wasn't just injured, it was ruined. She'd pushed too hard, asked too much of a limb that had always been fragile. The infection that Mrs. Fletcher had tried to clean out was spreading. She could feel it, a poison moving through her blood. Even if it healed, even if a doctor could save it, the foot would never carry her the way it had before. She'd be more dependent on crutches, more limited in what she could do. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd walked 60 miles to prove to herself that she was strong enough to be Thomas's wife, capable enough to build a life with him as an equal partner. And in doing so, she'd crippled herself worse than she'd ever been before. What kind of wife would she be now? She'd imagined helping Thomas at the sawmill, keeping house, raising children, working side by side to build something lasting. But how could she do any of that if she couldn't even walk across a room without help? The doubts crept in like the cold, insidious and numbing. Thomas had said beautiful things tonight, made promises about carrying her when she couldn't walk, but he'd said those things in the emotion of the moment, overwhelmed by the grand gesture of her impossible journey. What would he feel in a year, in 5 years, in 10, when the romance of the story had faded, and all that remained was the daily reality of a wife who couldn't keep up? She thought about his brother, the one who'd been sick with pneumonia, the reason Thomas couldn't come fetch her himself. Thomas had stayed to care for him, to nurse him through illness. He was a man who took responsibility seriously, who didn't abandon people who needed him. But that was exactly what frightened her. She didn't want to be someone he felt obligated to care for, someone he stayed with out of duty rather than desire. The rain intensified, wind rattling the window frame. Somewhere in the night, a shutter banged loose and kept slamming against the side of the building, irregular and jarring. Evangeline pulled the quilt up to her chin, trying to get warm, but the chill she felt had nothing to do with the temperature, and everything to do with the fear spreading through her chest. What if she'd made a terrible mistake? What if walking to Copper Falls had been the act of a foolish woman, too proud to admit she needed help? She could have waited, could have found another way, could have postponed the wedding until spring when travel would be easier. But no, she'd been so determined to prove something, to show that her foot didn't define her limitations, that she'd walked straight into disaster. And now Thomas would be tied to that disaster for the rest of his life. The fever dreams started sometime after midnight. Evangeline drifted in and out of consciousness, seeing her mother's face hovering above her, hearing her father's voice calling her name from somewhere far away. She walked endless trails that led nowhere, climbed mountains that grew steeper with every step. In the dreams, her foot wasn't twisted and swollen, but whole and strong, and she ran through forests without pain, leaped over streams, danced in meadows filled with wildflowers. Then she'd wake, gasping, and remember that those dreams were lies. Her foot would never be whole. She'd spent her entire life learning to work around its limitations, and now she'd destroyed even that careful accommodation. Mrs. Fletcher came in several times during the night to check on her, bringing cool cloths for her forehead, more willow bark tea, gentle words that Evangeline barely heard through the fog of fever. At some point, she became aware of voices outside her door, low and urgent. Mrs. Fletcher and someone else, a man with a deep voice. The doctor, perhaps, called in despite her protests. The door opened and lamplight spilled across the floor. Evangeline squinted against the brightness, trying to focus. The doctor was an older man with kind eyes and steady hands. He examined her foot with gentle efficiency, unwrapping the bandages, probing the swollen flesh, asking questions she couldn't quite track. "The infection's taken hold," he said to Mrs. Fletcher, his voice grave. "I can treat it, but she needs to stay off this foot completely for at least 2 weeks, maybe longer. No walking at all." "The wedding's tomorrow," Mrs. Fletcher said quietly. "Then she'll need to be carried to it," the doctor replied. "Because if she tries to walk on this foot again before it's healed, she'll do permanent damage. More permanent than what's already been done." Evangeline wanted to speak, to argue, to insist that she could manage, but the fever had stolen her voice. She lay there while the doctor applied fresh poultices that smelled sharp and medicinal, while he wrapped her foot in clean bandages, while he left powders and instructions with Mrs. Fletcher. After he left, Evangeline finally found her voice. "How bad?" she whispered. Mrs. Fletcher sat on the edge of the bed, her face showing the careful neutrality of someone delivering hard news. "He says with proper rest and care you'll heal, but you've done significant damage. The bones and tendons were already compromised from your condition, and you've pushed them beyond what they could bear." "Will I walk again?" "Yes, but not the same way you did before." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. Evangeline turned her face toward the wall, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Mrs. Fletcher squeezed her hand once, then quietly left the room, taking the lamp with her. In the darkness, Evangeline let herself grieve, not with the wild sobbing of earlier, but with a deeper, quieter sorrow. She mourned the independence she'd worked so hard to maintain, the careful balance she'd achieved between acknowledging her limitation and refusing to let it limit her. That balance was gone now, shattered by her own desperate determination. She thought about calling off the wedding, about telling Thomas in the morning that she couldn't marry him, that it wouldn't be fair to burden him with a wife who'd be even more dependent than he'd bargained for. The thought of it made her chest ache worse than her foot, but wouldn't it be kinder in the long run? Better to hurt him now than to watch his love slowly curdle into resentment over the years. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't do it. Not because she was brave or noble, but because she was selfish. Because despite everything, despite the pain and the fear and the certainty that she'd ruined herself, she still wanted to marry Thomas Ashford. She still wanted the life he'd described in his letters, the home he'd built, the future they'd imagined together. So she'd go through with the wedding tomorrow, and she'd hope that his love was strong enough to survive the reality of what she'd become. And if it wasn't, well, at least she'd have tried. Dawn came grey and reluctant, the rain having finally stopped but leaving behind low clouds and mist. Evangeline woke to find sunlight, pale and watery, filtering through the window. Her fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her weak but clear-headed. Mrs. Fletcher arrived with breakfast, helping her sit up against the pillows, insisting she eat, even though Evangeline had no appetite. "You need your strength for today," the older woman said firmly. "A wedding's no small thing, even when you're in perfect health." "I can't walk down an aisle," Evangeline said flatly. "The doctor said there is no weight on the foot." "Then you'll be carried," Mrs. Fletcher replied, as if this were the most reasonable solution in the world. "Or you'll use crutches if you prefer. The church isn't large. We'll make it work." "That's not how a wedding is supposed to go." "No, I suppose it's not. But then, walking 60 miles to get to your own wedding isn't how it's supposed to go either, and you manage that just fine." Mrs. Fletcher fixed her with a stern look. "Life rarely goes the way it's supposed to, child. The trick is doing it anyway." Before Evangeline could respond, there was a knock at the door. Mrs. Fletcher opened it to reveal Thomas, looking like he hadn't slept any better than Evangeline had. His eyes went immediately to her, searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "How is she?" he asked Mrs. Fletcher, though he never looked away from Evangeline. "Fever's broken. Foot's no worse. Doctor says she needs complete rest for at least 2 weeks." Thomas nodded slowly, then stepped into the room. "Could we have a moment?" Mrs. Fletcher glanced at Evangeline, who nodded, and then she slipped out, closing the door behind her. Thomas pulled a chair up to the bedside and sat down heavily, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, filled with all the things Evangeline wanted to say but couldn't find words for. Finally, Thomas broke it. "I've been thinking all night," he said quietly, "about what you did, about what it cost you, about what it means." Here it comes, Evangeline thought. The reality check, the moment when he realizes what he's getting into. "And I need to tell you something," Thomas continued. "Something I should have told you months ago, but I was afraid." Evangeline's heart hammered. "What?" He looked up at her then, and she saw fear in his eyes, real and raw. "My mother didn't just die when I was young. She died in childbirth, bringing my brother into the world. I was 12 years old, and I watched my father try to hold it together, try to raise us both while grieving her. He managed for 3 years before the grief killed him too. Heart just gave out one day while he was working in the fields." Evangeline reached for his hand, but he pulled back, not cruelly, just needing to finish. "I raised my brother myself from the time I was 15, worked every job I could find, built the house with my own hands, made sure he had food and clothes and schooling, and I swore to myself that I'd never ask someone to share that burden, never ask a woman to take on a ready-made family, a man with nothing but hard work and responsibilities to offer." "Thomas, let me finish," he said, his voice rough. "When I met you at that harvest festival, when I heard you laugh, I wanted so badly to be someone different, someone who could offer you an easy life, a simple courtship, all the things a woman deserves. But I couldn't. All I had was that house I'd built, and a brother who still needed raising, and dreams that probably seemed foolish to anyone practical." He finally looked at her again. "But you wrote back. You read my letters about building a life from nothing, about wanting a partner to help carry the hard things, and you said yes anyway. You saw all my limitations and my burdens, and you chose me." Tears were streaming down Evangeline's face now, understanding beginning to dawn. "So when I see you lying here, injured from a journey you should never have had to make alone, I don't see weakness," Thomas said fiercely. "I see someone who understands what I understood when I was 15 years old, standing beside 2 fresh graves. Sometimes the things worth having require us to break ourselves open to get them. Sometimes love means walking impossible distances on feet that weren't made for walking." He reached out then, cupping her face with one calloused hand. "You didn't ruin your yourself, Evangeline. You proved that you're exactly who I hoped you were. Someone strong enough to face hard things. Someone stubborn enough to keep going when everything says stop. Someone I'd be honored to walk beside or carry when walking isn't possible. But I'll slow you down, Evangeline whispered. I'll need help with things I used to do myself. I'll be more dependent, more limited. And I'll need your help with my brother, with building a life, with carrying all the responsibilities I've shouldered alone for too long, Thomas interrupted. We'll help each other, Evangeline. That's what I've been trying to tell you. That's what marriage is supposed to be. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers. So please stop trying to convince yourself that you're not enough. Stop trying to talk yourself out of this. Just marry me today, and let's figure out the rest together. Evangeline sobbed, all the fear and doubt of the long night pouring out of her. Thomas held her, letting her cry, murmuring reassurances into her hair. When she finally quieted, she pulled back enough to look at him. I'm scared, she admitted. I'm scared that someday you'll regret this, that you'll wish you'd married someone whole. I am marrying someone whole, Thomas said firmly. You're not defined by your foot any more than I'm defined by being an orphan. We're both whole people who've faced hard things and kept going. That's all anyone can ask. Promise me something, Evangeline said, echoing his words from the night before. Anything. Promise me you'll tell me if it ever gets to be too much. If helping me becomes a burden you resent. Promise you won't just stay out of obligation. Thomas smiled, sad and tender. I promise. But Evangeline, I need you to promise me the same thing. Promise you will tell me when you need help, instead of trying to do everything yourself. Promise you won't destroy yourself trying to prove you don't need me. Evangeline thought about the past 6 days, about walking until her foot gave out, rather than admitting she couldn't make the journey alone. She thought about all the years before that, always pushing, always proving, never asking for help, because asking felt like admitting defeat. That's going to be harder for me than it is for you, she admitted. I know, Thomas said. We'll work on it together. He kissed her then, gentle and careful, like she was something precious that might break. When he pulled back, there were tears on his cheeks too. So, we're doing this? He asked. We're getting married today? We're doing this, Evangeline confirmed. Though I have no idea how, considering I can't walk, and my wedding dress is probably ruined, and the dress is fine, Thomas interrupted. Mrs. Fletcher unpacked it last night, pressed it, said it survived the journey better than you did, he grinned. As for walking, I've been thinking about that too. Thomas, I can't use crutches down an aisle. It's not— I know, he said. So I'm going to carry you. Evangeline stared at him. You can't carry me down the aisle of a church in front of everyone. Why not? Because it's not how things are done. Because people will talk. Because you walked 60 miles to marry me and your foot gave out 10 miles from the finish line, Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm. So I'm going to carry you the last distance. I'm going to carry you into that church and up to that altar. And then I'm going to marry you, and anyone who wants to talk about it can talk all they want. Thomas, this is not negotiable, Evangeline. You've walked far enough. It's my turn to carry you. And looking into his eyes, seeing the absolute certainty there, Evangeline finally stopped arguing. She'd walked 50 miles alone. Maybe it was all right to let someone help her with the last 10. The news spread through Copper Falls like wildfire through dry brush. By mid-morning, it seemed the entire town knew that Thomas Ashford's bride had walked 60 miles through the mountains and arrived half dead at the inn, and that Thomas planned to carry her down the aisle that very afternoon. Mrs. Fletcher's daughters reported the gossip as they came and went, helping prepare Evangeline for the ceremony. Some folks thought it was the most romantic thing they'd ever heard. Others whispered that it was improper, that a woman who couldn't even walk to her own wedding had no business getting married at all. A few suggested Thomas was making a mistake, tying himself to an invalid out of misplaced chivalry. Evangeline heard it all, filtered through the well-meaning attempts of Mrs. Fletcher to shield her from the worst of it. Each whispered judgment landed like a stone in her chest, confirming fears she'd battled all night. But Thomas had been clear, and she'd made her choice. She was going through with this. The youngest Fletcher daughter, a girl of about 14 named Sarah, proved to be Evangeline's unexpected ally. While her older sisters fussed with the dress and worried about propriety, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed and spoke with the blunt honesty of youth. I think it's the bravest thing I've ever heard, she said, watching Evangeline wince as Mrs. Fletcher changed the bandages on her foot. Walking all that way just to keep a promise. Most people can't even walk to the end of their own street without complaining. I didn't make it all the way, Evangeline reminded her, the words still bitter in her mouth. You made it farther than anyone thought possible, Sarah countered. My pa says a club foot like yours should never have carried you more than a few miles. Says what you did was medically impossible. Your father's as the doctor? Sarah nodded. He's seen plenty of club feet in his time. Says yours is one of the worst cases he's encountered, on account of how the bones are twisted. Makes it even more remarkable that you managed what you did. Evangeline looked down at her bandaged foot, seeing it anew through the doctor's eyes. She'd always known it was bad, had understood she was luckier than most with her condition just to walk at all, but she'd never thought of her daily walking as remarkable. It had simply been necessary, a skill learned through her mother's determination and her own stubborn practice. Remarkable doesn't feel like the right word when you're lying in bed unable to stand, Evangeline said quietly. Maybe not, Sarah agreed, but give it time. My pa also says that with rest and proper care, you'll walk again. Different than before, maybe, slower, with more help, but you'll walk. Different than before. The phrase kept echoing in Evangeline's mind as the morning progressed. Everything was going to be different than before. Her foot, her capabilities, her life. She'd walked into these mountains as one version of herself and would leave as another. The question was whether Thomas truly understood that, or whether he'd fallen in love with who she'd been rather than who she was becoming. Around noon, there was a commotion downstairs. Evangeline heard multiple voices, furniture being moved, the front door opening and closing repeatedly. Mrs. Fletcher disappeared to investigate and returned with an expression caught between amusement and exasperation. Half the town's shown up, she announced, bringing flowers, bringing food, bringing opinions about how this wedding should be conducted. Thomas is down there trying to manage the chaos. Maybe we should postpone, Evangeline said, anxiety rising. This is turning into a spectacle. Every wedding's a spectacle, child. This one's just more honest about it. Mrs. Fletcher began laying out the wedding dress on the bed, smoothing the wrinkles with practiced hands. Besides, Thomas won't hear of postponing. I've never seen a man more determined to marry someone than he is to marry you. The dress had indeed survived the journey better than its owner. The cream muslin was only slightly creased, the bone buttons still gleamed, and the embroidered wild flowers along the hem looked as fresh as the day Evangeline had stitched them. Looking at it now, she remembered every hour spent sewing, every dream she'd stitched into the fabric. She'd made this dress for a different wedding, one where she'd walk down an aisle on her own power, but it would still be her wedding, and she'd still wear it, even if the circumstances had changed. Let's get you dressed, Mrs. Fletcher said gently, understanding in her eyes. It took 3 women to accomplish what Evangeline would normally have done herself. They helped her sit up, supported her as they slipped the dress over her head, fastened the buttons, arranged the skirts to fall properly around her legs. Sarah braided Evangeline's hair and pinned it up in a simple style, weaving in small white flowers someone had brought. The eldest Fletcher daughter produced a veil, something borrowed from her own wedding, and draped it carefully over Evangeline's head. When they finally brought a mirror, Evangeline almost didn't recognize herself. Despite the pallor from fever and pain, despite the shadows under her eyes from a sleepless night, she looked like a bride. The dress fit perfectly. The flowers in her hair caught the weak afternoon light, and the veil softened everything into something almost ethereal. Beautiful, Mrs. Fletcher declared. Absolutely beautiful. Thomas won't be able to breathe when he sees you, Sarah added with the romantic certainty of a 14-year-old. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Fletcher opened it to reveal a young man who looked startlingly like Thomas, though several years younger and considerably thinner. His face still showed the pallor of recent illness, but his eyes were bright with curiosity and warmth. Miss Hartwell, he said, I'm Daniel Ashford, Thomas's brother. He sent me to check if you're ready. As ready as I'll ever be, Evangeline replied, studying the boy who would be her new brother. How is he? Nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs, Daniel grinned. But happy. Happier than I've seen him in years, actually. Maybe ever. His expression grew more serious. Thank you for what you did, for walking all that way. Thomas has been alone for so long, taking care of me, working himself half to death. He deserves someone who'd fight that hard to get to him. I didn't do it to be thanked, Evangeline said softly. I know, that's what makes it mean something. Daniel glanced at her bandaged foot, carefully propped on pillows. Thomas told me about his plan to carry you. I think it's perfect, for what it's worth. Romantic and practical all at once. What does the town think? Daniel shrugged. Half of them think it's scandalous. The other half are crying into their handkerchiefs about how beautiful it is. Either way, they'll all be at the church. Nobody wants to miss this wedding. After Daniel left to report back to Thomas, the women began the delicate process of moving Evangeline. They fashioned a sort of chair carry, using a sturdy wooden seat and poles, 4 men recruited to bear the weight. It wasn't elegant, but it would get her to the church without putting weight on her injured foot. The journey from inn to church was only a few hundred yards, but to Evangeline it felt like miles. She could hear the murmur of voices as they approached, see faces peering from windows and doorways. The afternoon sun had broken through the clouds, casting everything in golden light that seemed almost too bright after the dim room at the inn. The church was a simple white clapboard building with a modest steeple, surrounded by oak trees whose leaves had turned brilliant shades of amber and scarlet. The doors stood open, and Evangeline could see people filling the pews inside. More people than she'd expected, more than she'd wanted. They carried her around to a side entrance where she could wait out of sight until the ceremony began. Reverend Peters was there, looking relieved to see her upright and dressed. He explained briefly how things would proceed, then asked the question she'd been dreading. "Are you certain you want to do this today? No one would fault you for waiting until you're stronger." "I'm certain," Evangeline said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I walked 60 miles to marry Thomas Ashford. I'm not waiting for another day." The Reverend smiled. "Then let's get you married." He disappeared inside to begin the ceremony. Evangeline sat in her makeshift chair, hands trembling, heart pounding. Through the open door she could hear the Reverend welcoming everyone, speaking about the sacredness of marriage, the covenant being entered into. Then he paused, and his next words carried clearly. "Today we gather to witness a marriage that began long before either party reached this altar. It began in letters exchanged across distances, in promises made and kept, in a journey that tested the limits of human endurance and proved that love can carry us farther than our own strength ever could." Inside the church, someone sniffled. Evangeline heard the rustle of handkerchiefs being retrieved. "The bride cannot walk to meet her groom today," the Reverend continued, "having spent her strength on the journey to reach him, so the groom will come to meet her and carry her the final distance. Let this be a symbol of the marriage they're entering into, a reminder that we are called to carry one another through all of life's difficulties." Footsteps on the wooden floor. Then Thomas appeared in the doorway, backlit by the afternoon sun streaming through the church windows. He wore a simple suit, probably borrowed, and his hair was neatly combed, but it was his expression that stopped Evangeline's breath. He looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked, the end of every search he'd ever begun. He crossed to where she sat and knelt down, taking both her hands in his. "Ready?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she whispered. "But Thomas, are you sure? Once we do this, once everyone sees you carry me in there, you'll be tied to this story forever. People will always remember you as the man who married the crippled bride." Thomas cupped her face with one hand, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Evangeline, I want to be remembered as the man who was loved enough that a woman walked 60 miles through mountains to marry him. I want to be remembered as the man who was smart enough to recognize strength when he saw it, even when it came wrapped in bandages and exhaustion. But most of all, I want to be remembered as your husband. Everything else is just details." He stood then, and before she could say anything else, he simply picked her up, one arm beneath her knees, careful of her injured foot, the other supporting her back. She weighed more than many women she knew, sturdy as folks back home had always said, but Thomas lifted her like she was precious cargo, like her weight was a gift rather than a burden. "Hold on to me," he murmured, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, veil trailing behind them like a banner. Thomas carried her through the door and into the church. The congregation rose as one, turning to watch. Evangeline saw faces she didn't know, townspeople who'd come out of curiosity or pity or genuine goodwill. She saw Daniel in the front row, grinning widely. She saw Mrs. Fletcher and her daughters already dabbing at their eyes. She saw the doctor, his expression professionally approving of Thomas's careful handling of his patient. She saw strangers and almost friends and people whose opinions of her she'd never know. And then she stopped looking at them and looked only at Thomas, at the determined set of his jaw, the slight smile playing at his lips, the absolute certainty in his eyes. He carried her down that aisle like it was the most natural thing in the world, like this was exactly how he'd always planned to meet his bride at the altar. When they reached the front of the church, there was a moment of awkward logistics. How exactly did one conduct a wedding ceremony when the bride couldn't stand? But Thomas solved it simply by sitting down on the front pew with Evangeline in his lap, holding her carefully, her injured foot propped at an angle that didn't hurt. The Reverend adapted smoothly, standing before them, rather than having them stand before him. He spoke about marriage as a partnership, about two people choosing to walk through life together, supporting each other through trials and triumphs. His words were simple but sincere, and Evangeline found herself listening, not just to what he said, but to what she could hear beneath it, the deeper truths about commitment and sacrifice, and choosing to love someone despite and because of all their complications. When it came time for vows, Thomas spoke first, his voice steady and clear enough for everyone in the church to hear. "Evangeline May Hartwell, I vow to love you in strength and in weakness, in health and in sickness, in times when you can walk beside me and in times when you need me to carry you. I vow to see you always as the woman who walked 60 miles to keep a promise, not as the one who needed help with the last 10. I vow to build a life with you where we carry each other through whatever distances remain." Evangeline's turn. Her voice shook at first, but grew stronger with each word. Thomas Benjamin Ashford, I vow to love you with honesty and humility, to ask for help when I need it, and to offer help when you need me. I vow to never again try to walk impossible distances alone when I could walk them with you. I vow to build a life with you where our strength is measured not by what we can do independently, but by what we can do together. The Reverend pronounced them married, and Thomas kissed her there in front of everyone, gentle and thorough and full of promise. The congregation applauded, and someone in the back started crying so loudly that others joined in, and suddenly the whole church was filled with the sound of people weeping and clapping and celebrating this strange, beautiful, imperfect wedding. Thomas carried Evangeline back down the aisle as his wife. She waved to people as they passed, no longer ashamed to be carried, no longer worried about what they thought. She'd done something impossible to get here, and she'd failed at the very end, and she'd been carried the rest of the way. And somehow all of that was exactly right. Outside the church, people had gathered to see them off. Someone had decorated a wagon with ribbons and late-blooming flowers. Thomas set Evangeline carefully in the back of it, propping her foot on cushions someone had provided, then climbed in beside her. Where are we going? Evangeline asked as he took up the reins. Home, Thomas said simply. To the house I built, to start the life we promised each other. As the wagon rolled away from the church, Evangeline looked back one last time at the building where she'd become a wife. The afternoon sun painted everything gold, and the people waving goodbye were just silhouettes against the light, their individual features lost in the general warmth of well-wishing. She'd walked 50 miles and been carried 10. She'd destroyed her foot and found her future. She'd learned that strength wasn't about refusing help, but about knowing when to accept it. And she'd married a man who understood that carrying someone wasn't the same as being burdened by them. The wagon rumbled over the rough road, heading toward whatever came next. Evangeline leaned against Thomas, feeling his arm come around her shoulders, solid and sure. Her foot throbbed with each jolt of the wheels, a reminder that healing would take time, that she'd changed in ways she was still discovering. But she was going home, not to the empty cabin in Birchwood Hollow, but to a new home with a man who'd promised to carry her when walking became too hard. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. The wagon rolled on through the autumn afternoon, carrying them both toward a future they'd build together, one careful step at a time. The house Thomas had built sat on a gentle rise about 2 miles outside Copper Falls, overlooking a valley where the river curved like a silver ribbon through stands of pine and aspen. It wasn't large, just 3 rooms and a loft, but every board had been cut and placed with care. The windows faced east to catch the morning sun, and a wide porch wrapped around 2 sides, perfect for sitting and watching the seasons change. Thomas carried Evangeline over the threshold, a tradition he observed with a slight smile, given that he'd been carrying her for most of their wedding day. Inside, the house smelled of fresh wood and the herbs someone had hung to dry from the rafters. The main room held a stone fireplace, a sturdy table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair positioned near the hearth, simple, functional, and clearly built by someone who understood that a home was measured not in grandeur, but in comfort. Daniel's staying at the mill for the next few days, Thomas said, setting Evangeline carefully in the rocking chair, giving us time to settle in. Though knowing him, he'll probably show up tomorrow with some excuse about needing a book he left behind. Evangeline looked around the space that would now be her home, trying to imagine herself here, trying to picture days and weeks and years unfolding in these rooms. It felt both right and terrifyingly unknown, like standing at the edge of something vast. It's perfect, she said, and meant it. The first days of married life were nothing like Evangeline had imagined back in Birchwood Hollow when she'd dreamed of this moment. She'd pictured herself cooking meals, learning the rhythms of Thomas's day, exploring her new home and town. Instead, she spent most of her time in that rocking chair, or in the bedroom, her foot propped on pillows, following doctor's orders to stay completely off it. Thomas proved to be surprisingly capable at domestic tasks. He cooked simple but hearty meals, brought her tea without being asked, changed her bandages with gentle efficiency that suggested he'd done nursing before. When she asked about it, he told her about caring for Daniel through the pneumonia, about the long nights watching his brother struggle to breathe, about learning to be both mother and father to a frightened child. You learn what you need to learn, he said simply. When there's no one else to do it, you figure it out. But it was the small moments between the caretaking that revealed who Thomas truly was. The way he'd read to her in the evenings from books he'd collected over the years, his voice steady and soothing. The way he'd describe his day at the sawmill in detail, including her in a life she couldn't yet physically participate in. The way he'd sit on the edge of the bed at night and tell her about the improvements he planned for the house, asking her opinions, making it clear that this was her home to shape as much as his. On the 4th day, Evangeline woke to find Thomas gone, and a note on the table written in his careful script. Had to go to the mill early. Breakfast is in the warming oven. Don't try to walk. I'll know if you do. She smiled at that last line, so typical of his gentle firmness. But as the morning stretched on and she sat alone in the quiet house, restlessness began to gnaw at her. She'd never been good at sitting still, had always found purpose in work and movement. Now, forced into stillness, she felt useless in a way that had nothing to do with her foot and everything to do with her sense of self. When Thomas returned at midday to check on her, he found her in tears. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately kneeling beside the rocking chair. "Are you in pain? Should I fetch the doctor?" "No," Evangeline managed. "It's not my foot. It's just, I can't do anything. I can't cook or clean or help with anything. I'm just sitting here being useless while you work all day and then come home to take care of me like I'm a child." Thomas sat back on his heels, studying her face. "You're not useless. You're healing." "It feels the same from where I'm sitting." He was quiet for a moment, then stood and disappeared into the bedroom. When he returned, he was carrying a large basket filled with fabric scraps, thread, needles and buttons. "I found these at the general store. The owner said you were a seamstress back in Birchwood Hollow, maybe the best in 3 counties. I thought maybe you could use something to do with your hands while your foot heals." Evangeline stared at the basket, emotion welling up so fast it caught her by surprise. "You bought me sewing supplies?" "Well, technically I traded for them. The store owner's wife needed someone to mend some quilts, and I said my wife could do it if she was interested. No pressure, but I thought you might like having a project." She reached into the basket, pulling out a piece of soft blue cotton, running it through her fingers. The familiar texture grounded her, reminded her of who she'd been before the walk, before the wedding, before everything changed. "I'd like that very much." Thomas smiled. "Good, because I also might have mentioned to a few people that you were accepting mending work, and there may be a small pile of items arriving over the next few days." "Thomas Ashford, did you just arrange employment for me without asking?" "I arranged opportunities," he corrected. "Whether you take them is entirely up to you." That afternoon, Evangeline set up a sewing station at the table where she could sit with her foot elevated on a second chair. Her hands remembered the work even if they were shaky from disuse. She started with something simple, hemming a tablecloth that had come unstitched, and found a peace in the repetitive motion that she hadn't felt since arriving in Copper Falls. When Thomas came home that evening, she'd finished 3 items and started on a 4th. He examined her work with genuine admiration, running his fingers over her tiny, precise stitches. "The store owner was right. You're incredibly talented." "It's just mending," Evangeline said, but she couldn't hide her pleasure at his praise. "It's craftsmanship," Thomas corrected. "There's a difference between fixing something and fixing it well. You do it well." Over the following weeks, a routine developed. Thomas would leave for the sawmill before dawn, return at midday to check on Evangeline, and share lunch, then work until evening. Evangeline would spend her days sewing, her pile of finished work growing steadily. People began stopping by to drop off items or pick up completed work, and these brief visits became her window into the community she'd married into. Mrs. Fletcher came by regularly, usually bringing food and gossip in equal measure. She told Evangeline about the town's history, about who was related to whom, about the unspoken rules and expectations that governed small community life. It was through Mrs. Fletcher that Evangeline learned Thomas was more respected than he realized, that people valued his honesty and hard work, that he'd helped more than one family through difficult times without asking for anything in return. "He's a good man," Mrs. Fletcher said one afternoon, watching Evangeline embroider flowers onto a child's dress. "But he's been alone too long, carrying too much by himself. It's good he has you now." "I'm not sure how much help I am, stuck in this chair," Evangeline replied. Mrs. Fletcher gave her a sharp look. "Help isn't measured in how many chores you can do, child. That man comes home every day to someone who chose him, who fought to get to him. That's worth more than a clean floor." Sarah Fletcher, the doctor's daughter, became a regular visitor as well. She was fascinated by Evangeline's sewing and begged to be taught. Evangeline discovered she enjoyed teaching, enjoyed watching Sarah's clumsy first stitches gradually become more controlled and confident. The girl chattered endlessly about town happenings, about her dreams of someday leaving Copper Falls and seeing the wider world, about the books she'd read and the adventures she imagined. "Don't you ever want to travel?" Sarah asked one day. "See places beyond these mountains?" Evangeline thought about the 60 miles she'd walked, about every aching step through unfamiliar territory. "I've done my traveling," she said with a small smile. "Now I'm ready to build something that stays still." Daniel moved back into the house after the first week, and his presence added a new dimension to Evangeline's days. He was 17, caught between boyhood and manhood, still recovering his strength from the pneumonia. He'd clearly been nervous about meeting his new sister-in-law, unsure how to behave around her. Evangeline made it easy for him. She asked about his interests, learned he loved books as much as Thomas did, that he dreamed of becoming a teacher someday. She enlisted his help with her sewing projects, having him hold fabric taut while she cut or thread needles when her hands grew tired. He began reading aloud to her in the afternoons, his young voice bringing stories to life in ways that made the hours pass quickly. "I'm glad Thomas married you," Daniel said one evening after finishing a chapter of an adventure novel. "He's been different since you arrived. Lighter somehow." "How was he before?" Evangeline asked, curious about the man she'd married but still getting to know. Daniel considered the question carefully, like he was carrying the world on his shoulders and didn't know how to put it down. "He worked constantly, never took time for himself, always making sure I had what I needed, but never thinking about what he needed." He looked at Evangeline directly. "You make him think about himself again, about being happy instead of just surviving." The conversation stayed with Evangeline long after Daniel went to bed. She thought about Thomas's letters, about how he'd written of wanting a life that meant something, a partnership to share, both burdens and joys. She'd been so focused on what she couldn't offer him, on her limitations and dependencies, that she'd missed what she did bring to his life simply by being there, by choosing him, by making this house a home instead of just a shelter. One evening, about 3 weeks after the wedding, Thomas came home to find Evangeline sitting on the porch. She'd convinced Daniel to help her outside, wanting to see the sunset over the valley. Her foot was still bandaged, but the swelling had gone down considerably, and the doctor had said she could begin putting minimal weight on it soon. Thomas sat beside her on the porch step, close enough that their shoulders touched. They watched the sky turn from blue to gold to deep purple, the first stars beginning to emerge above the mountains. "I've been thinking," Thomas said finally, "about the house." "What about it?" "It's built for function, not really for comfort. I made it practical when it was just Daniel and me. But now that you're here, I want to make it better, add things that would make your life easier." "Like what?" "A proper workroom for your sewing, with big windows for light. Maybe a addition on the east side. Give us more space. Daniel's getting older, needs his own room properly. And I was thinking about building a ramp alongside the steps for when your foot is healing and you need something easier than stairs." Evangeline turned to look at him. "Thomas, that's a lot of work and expense." "It's an investment," he said simply, "in our life together. I built this house imagining a future, but it was abstract then. Now you're here, making it real, and I want the house to reflect that. You don't have to change everything for me." "I'm not changing everything. I'm improving things. There's a difference." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together. "Besides, I like the idea of building something together, even if you're directing from a chair while I do the actual hammering." She laughed, the sound carrying across the quiet valley. "I suppose I could manage that." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. Then Thomas spoke again, his voice quiet but intense. "You know what surprised me most about being married?" "What?" "How much easier everything feels. Not the work itself, that's still hard, but coming home knowing someone's here, someone who wants to hear about my day, someone who's building a life alongside me instead of me building it alone. It makes the hard things feel less heavy." Evangeline squeezed his hand. "I feel the same way, even stuck in that chair, unable to do half the things I thought I'd be doing as your wife. I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." "You are," Thomas said firmly, "and you're doing more than you realize. Daniel's happier than I've seen him in years. The house feels like a home now, instead of just a place we sleep. And He paused, searching for words. "I don't feel alone anymore. That's worth more than any amount of cooking or cleaning could ever be." As the stars multiplied overhead, Evangeline realized something fundamental had shifted. She'd spent so much energy worrying about being enough, about proving her worth through what she could do, that she'd nearly missed the simple truth Thomas had understood all along. Love wasn't a transaction of services rendered and debts paid. It was choosing to build something together, to carry each other through hard things, to make a life that was richer for being shared. Her foot still hurt. She still couldn't walk more than a few steps without help. She still faced months of healing and uncertainty about what her capabilities would ultimately be. But sitting there on the porch with her husband's hand in hers, watching the night settle over the valley like a blessing, she felt something she hadn't felt since before the long walk began. She felt home. Inside, Daniel called out that he'd made tea if they wanted any. Thomas stood, then offered Evangeline his hand. She took it, letting him help her to her feet, leaning on him as they made their slow way back into the house. The lamplight spilled warm and golden through the windows, and she could see Daniel moving around the kitchen, setting out cups. This was her life now. Not the one she'd imagined when she first decided to walk to Copper Falls, but something richer and stranger and more real. She'd walked 60 miles thinking she had to prove she was strong enough to deserve love. Instead, she'd discovered that love wasn't something you earned through strength. It was something you built together, one careful step at a time, carrying each other when the path grew too steep to walk alone. Thomas's arm came around her waist, supporting her weight as they crossed the threshold together. And Evangeline, who'd spent so much of her life walking alone, finally understood what it meant to let someone else help carry her home. 6 weeks after the wedding, Dr. Fletcher declared Evangeline's foot healed enough to begin walking again. Not the walking she'd done before, he cautioned, and certainly not without assistance, but walking nonetheless. Thomas had fashioned a sturdy cane from oak, sanded smooth and carved with a pattern of leaves along the handle. He presented it to her one morning with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for far grander gifts. "I thought about buying one from the general store," he said, watching as Evangeline ran her fingers over the carved wood. "But then I figured, if you're going to use something every day, it should be made special." The first steps were terrifying. Evangeline stood in the main room of the house, Thomas on one side, the cane on the other, and tried to remember how to trust her body. Her left foot, still wrapped in lighter bandages now, touched the floor with a weight that felt both familiar and foreign. The pain was there, but duller than before, more of a deep ache than the sharp agony she'd endured during the walk. She took one step, then another. Her gait was different now, more pronounced in its unevenness, requiring the cane to compensate for what her foot could no longer do. But she was walking, actually walking. "How does it feel?" Thomas asked, his hand hovering near her elbow, ready to catch her if she fell. "Strange," Evangeline admitted. "Like I'm learning something I already knew, but the rules have changed. Take your time. There's no rush." But there was a rush, at least in Evangeline's heart. She'd been confined for weeks, dependent on others for the simplest movements. Now, even with the cane, even with the limitations, she had mobility again. She had independence, or at least a version of it. Over the following days, Evangeline practiced walking with a determination that reminded Thomas of the woman who'd walked 60 miles to marry him. She'd circle the main room, then venture onto the porch, then slowly down the porch steps, using the railing Thomas had reinforced. Each day, she pushed a little further, tested her limits a little more. Daniel watched her progress with open admiration. "You're stubborn as a mule," he said one afternoon, half complaint and half compliment. "That's not the first time I've been told that," Evangeline replied, pausing to rest on the porch railing. "Probably won't be the last. Thomas is the same way. You two are well matched." It was true. Thomas had his own brand of quiet determination, visible in everything from the way he worked at the sawmill to the way he'd begun building the addition to the house. Every evening after supper, he'd spend an hour or two framing walls, laying floorboards, creating the workroom he'd promised Evangeline. He never complained about the extra labor, never suggested it was too much on top of his regular work. "Why do you think he pushes himself so hard?" Evangeline asked Daniel one evening, while Thomas was outside hammering by lamplight. Daniel considered the question, his expression thoughtful beyond his years. "I think when our parents died, he decided he had to be strong enough for both of us, had to work hard enough, be responsible enough, sacrifice enough to make up for what we'd lost. And once you start living that way, it's hard to stop, even when you don't have to anymore." "Do you think he knows he doesn't have to do everything alone now?" "He's learning," Daniel said with a slight smile. "You're teaching him." The following Sunday, Reverend Peters invited Evangeline and Thomas to a community gathering at the church. It was a harvest celebration, he explained, a tradition where everyone brought food to share and gave thanks for the year's blessings. Attendance was expected, though not mandatory. Evangeline felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect. She'd been largely isolated since arriving in Copper Falls, seeing only the people who visited the house or the few she encountered during her short walks around the property. Facing the entire community, knowing they'd all heard the story of her walk and her wedding, felt daunting. "We don't have to go if you're not ready," Thomas said, reading her hesitation. "No, I want to go," Evangeline replied, surprising herself with the truth of it. "I can't hide in this house forever. These are our neighbors. I should meet them properly." The morning of the gathering, Evangeline dressed with care in a simple green dress she'd made from fabric Mrs. Fletcher had brought by. She braided her hair and pinned it up, then practiced walking with the cane until she felt reasonably confident she wouldn't embarrass herself. The churchyard was filled with tables laden with food, children running between adults, the sound of conversation and laughter filling the autumn air. As Evangeline and Thomas approached, walking slowly to accommodate her pace, conversations seemed to pause. Heads turned, eyes followed their progress. Evangeline felt her cheeks flush, her grip on the cane tightening, but Thomas's hand found the small of her back, steady and reassuring, and she kept walking. Mrs. Fletcher was the first to break the awkward silence, bustling over with her characteristic energy. "Evangeline, so good to see you up and about. Come, come, you must try the apple butter I made." And there's fresh bread, and Martha Whitmore brought her famous pickles. The older woman's enthusiastic welcome seemed to give others permission to approach. Within minutes, Evangeline found herself surrounded by people introducing themselves, offering condolences about her injury, complimenting her dress, asking about her sewing work. It was overwhelming but not unkind, curiosity rather than judgment. A young mother named Helen Bradshaw asked if Evangeline might be able to let out some of her dresses, as she was expecting her third child and nothing fit properly anymore. An elderly man named Mr. Grayson wondered if she could repair his wife's wedding quilt, which had torn along one seam. A girl of about 10 shyly asked if Evangeline was the lady who'd walked through the mountains, and could she really walk 60 miles? I walked 50, Evangeline corrected gently. My husband carried me the last 10. The girl's eyes went wide. That's still more than I've ever walked. You must be very brave. Before Evangeline could respond, Reverend Peters called everyone to gather. The crowd moved toward a clearing where chairs had been arranged in a loose circle. Thomas guided Evangeline to a seat, settling beside her, Daniel on her other side. The Reverend spoke briefly about gratitude and community, about the importance of recognizing the ways people contributed to the life of the town. Then he did something unexpected. This year, we've been blessed with new members of our community, he said, his gaze finding Evangeline, and I think it's fitting to acknowledge not just their arrival, but the extraordinary story that brought them here. Evangeline's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected to be singled out, hadn't wanted this kind of attention. Evangeline Ashford walked 60 miles through mountain territory to honor a promise, the Reverend continued. She walked until her body gave out, and then her husband carried her the rest of the way. Their story has reminded us all what commitment truly means, what it looks like to fight for the things and people we love. He paused, and in that pause, something shifted in the gathered crowd. People were nodding, murmuring agreement. The Reverend continued. But what I think gets overlooked in that remarkable story is what happened after the walk, after the wedding. Evangeline has spent the past 6 weeks healing in a house she'd never seen before, in a town full of strangers, learning to walk all over again. And in that time, she quietly built connections, offered her skills to anyone who asked, become part of our community, not through grand gestures, but through small, daily acts of kindness and competence. He smiled at her directly now. So I wanted to take a moment to formally welcome Evangeline to Copper Falls, and to thank her for reminding us that strength comes in many forms. The strength to walk impossible distances, yes, but also the strength to accept help when we need it, to rebuild when we're broken, and to choose love even when it requires us to be vulnerable. The crowd applauded, and Evangeline felt tears prick her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed this public recognition that she belonged here, that her worth wasn't measured solely by the dramatic story of her arrival, but by the quieter story of her staying. Thomas squeezed her hand, his expression proud and tender. Daniel leaned over and whispered, "See, I told you, people loved you." After the Reverend finished, several people approached to speak with Evangeline directly. But it was Mr. Grayson, the elderly man who'd asked about quilt repair, who said something that lodged in her heart. "My wife walked with a limp her whole life," he said quietly. "Accident when she was young. People always looked at her like she was less somehow, like the limp defined her. But she was the strongest person I ever knew. Raised 6 children, ran our household, kept me in line for 52 years before she passed." He paused, his eyes distant with memory. "When I heard about you walking those mountains on a clubfoot, I thought of her. She would have loved your story, would have said you proved what she always knew, that a limp is just how someone walks, not who they are." Evangeline couldn't speak around the lump in her throat, so she just reached out and squeezed the old man's weathered hand. He nodded, understanding, and moved away to let others speak. The gathering continued through the afternoon. Evangeline found herself in conversation after conversation, learning about the people who made up this community, hearing their stories, beginning to weave herself into the fabric of Copper Falls. Her foot ached from sitting so long, then from standing to try some of the food. But it was a manageable ache, one she could work around. As the sun began to sink toward the western peaks, Thomas suggested they head home before full dark. They said their goodbyes, Evangeline moving slowly through the crowd with her cane, accepting well wishes and invitations to visit. On the walk back to the house, Daniel ran ahead, eager to get home to a book he'd been reading. Thomas and Evangeline walked slowly, the evening air cool and pleasant, the first stars beginning to emerge overhead. "That was good," Thomas said. "You're there, meeting everyone. It mattered." "The Reverend's speech was unexpected," Evangeline replied. "I didn't know he was going to do that. He asked me about it beforehand. I told him it was up to him, but that I thought you deserved to be recognized for more than just the walk. Thomas glanced at her. Was it all right? I know you don't like being the center of attention. It was more than all right, Evangeline said softly. It was exactly what I needed, even though I didn't know I needed it. They walked in comfortable silence for a while. The only sounds their footsteps on the dirt road and the evening calls of birds settling in for the night. Then Thomas stopped, turning to face her. There's something I want to tell you, he said. Something I've been thinking about for weeks, but couldn't find the right words for. Evangeline's heart quickened. What is it? When I asked you to marry me, back in Birchwood Hollow, in your garden, I thought I understood what I was asking. I thought I was asking you to share my life, to help me build something, to be my partner. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts, but I didn't really understand what partnership meant, not truly. Thomas, let me finish, he said gently. I thought partnership meant two people working side by side toward common goals, and it is that. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how you've handled everything, I've learned it's more than that. It's about creating something together that neither of us could create alone. It's about being changed by each other, becoming better because of each other. He reached up, cupping her face with both hands. You've changed me, Evangeline. You've taught me that accepting help isn't weakness, that letting someone see your vulnerabilities can make you stronger, that love isn't about being perfect for each other, but about being honest with each other. Evangeline felt tears spill down her cheeks. You've changed me too. You've shown me that I don't have to prove my worth through what I can do, that being loved doesn't require me to be invincible. We're both still learning, Thomas said, his thumbs brushing away her tears. But I want you to know that I'm grateful for every lesson, every hard moment, every small victory, every time you let me help you, and every time you help me. This marriage, this life we're building, it's the best thing I've ever done. Even though I'm not the wife you expected, Evangeline asked, old insecurities surfacing. Even though I can't do all the things I thought I'd be able to do? Especially because of that, Thomas said firmly. You're not the wife I expected. You're better. You're real and complicated and brave enough to show me when you're struggling. That's worth more than any idealized version I might have imagined. He kissed her then, there on the road with the stars coming out above them, and Evangeline felt something settle deep in her chest. Not the butterflies of new love or the anxiety of uncertainty, but something steadier and deeper, a sense of being known completely and loved anyway, not in spite of her limitations, but as a whole person who included those limitations. When they finally pulled apart, Thomas kept his forehead pressed to hers. I love you, he said simply, not for what you can do or what you've overcome, or any of the dramatic parts of your story. I love you for who you are right now, in this moment, complicated and imperfect, and exactly who I want to build a life with. I love you too, Evangeline whispered, more than I thought it was possible to love someone. They stood there in the gathering darkness, holding each other, until Daniel's voice called out from the house, asking if they were planning to stand in the road all night. They laughed, breaking apart, and continued their slow walk home. That night, after Daniel had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Evangeline sat at her sewing table, working on a project she'd kept secret. For weeks, she'd been piecing together fabric scraps into a quilt, each square representing something from their story. Blue for the sky over the mountains she'd walked through, brown for the earth that had held her up, green for the new life she'd found in Copper Falls, white for the wedding dress that had survived the journey. But now she added a new square, golden yellow like the sunset they'd watched together on the road. She stitched it carefully into place, part of a larger pattern that was slowly revealing itself. Thomas came up behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. What are you making? Our story, Evangeline said simply. The real one. Not just the walk or the wedding, but everything after. The hard parts, and the beautiful parts, and all the small moments in between. Thomas leaned down, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. How does it end? Evangeline smiled, her needle moving steadily through the fabric. It doesn't. It just keeps going, one stitch at a time, getting bigger and more complicated and more beautiful the longer we work on it. Together, Thomas added. Together, Evangeline agreed. Outside, the autumn wind picked up, rustling the leaves on the trees around their house. Inside, lamplight glowed warm against the darkness, and two people who'd found each other across impossible distances continued building a life that was richer for being shared. The walk was over, the healing continued, and the real story, the one that would matter most in the end, was just beginning. Winter came to Copper Falls with the first snowfall in late November, transforming the valley into something quiet and pristine. Evangeline stood on the porch of the house, wrapped in her mother's old cloak, watching fat flakes drift down from a gray sky. Her cane rested against the railing within easy reach, but for the moment she didn't need it. She'd learned to stand still without support, had learned the difference between resting and giving up. Behind her she could hear Thomas and Daniel working on the new addition. The workroom was nearly finished now, with large windows that would flood the space with light come spring. Thomas had built shelves for fabric storage, a long cutting table at just the right height, even a small stove to keep the room warm during the coldest months. Every detail had been considered, every measurement checked with Evangeline to ensure it would serve her needs. The past months had taught her something unexpected, that home wasn't a place you arrived at fully formed, but something you built slowly, through intention and effort and the willingness to adapt when things didn't go according to plan. This house was different now than when she'd first been carried over its threshold. It had expanded, improved, shaped itself around the lives being lived within it, just as she had been shaped by those same months into someone both familiar and new. "You'll catch a cold out here," Thomas said, emerging from the addition with sawdust in his hair and a smile on his face. He joined her at the railing, slipping an arm around her waist in the easy affection they'd developed over their months together. "I'm watching the first real snow," Evangeline replied, leaning into his warmth. "Back in Birchwood Hollow, the first snow always felt lonely. This feels different." "How so?" "Like a beginning instead of an ending." Thomas pulled her closer, both of them watching the valley disappear beneath a blanket of white. "The workroom will be finished by week's end," he said, "just in time. Mrs. Fletcher told me half the town wants to commission work from you for Christmas gifts." Evangeline had built a reputation over the past months. Her stitching was precise, her designs creative, and she had a gift for understanding what people wanted even when they couldn't quite articulate it themselves. What had started as simple mending had evolved into custom work, alterations, even a few wedding dresses. She'd become known not as Thomas Ashford's invalid wife, but as Evangeline Ashford, the finest seamstress in Copper Falls. "I'll need to hire help if the work keeps increasing," she said, half joking. "Sarah Fletcher's been hinting she'd like to apprentice properly," Thomas suggested, "and you'd be good for her. Teach her a trade while she figures out what she wants from life." It was a good idea, and Evangeline found herself warming to it. She enjoyed Sarah's company, appreciated the girl's quick mind and eager questions. Teaching her properly would be rewarding in ways that went beyond just getting help with the work. "I'll talk to her parents," Evangeline decided. That evening, after supper, Evangeline finished the quilt she'd been working on for months. The final stitches went in by lamplight, Daniel reading aloud nearby, while Thomas sketched plans for spring planting in a worn notebook. It was an ordinary evening, the kind that made up the substance of a life, but Evangeline found herself pausing to appreciate it. These quiet moments, she'd learned, were what marriage was mostly made of. Not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the simple comfort of being together while doing separate things. She held up the completed quilt, examining it in the lamplight. The pattern had emerged slowly over the weeks, each square telling part of their story. The blue of mountain sky, the brown of earth, the green of new growth, the white of her wedding dress. But there were other colors too now. Gold for the sunsets they watched together, red for the first autumn leaves, gray for the stone fireplace that warmed their home, purple for the wildflowers Thomas had picked for her one afternoon just because. "It's beautiful," Thomas said, setting aside his notebook to look properly. "Is it finished?" "This version is," Evangeline replied, "but I think I'll keep adding to it, make it bigger as our story grows. A lifetime project then." "Exactly." She folded the quilt carefully and set it in the cedar chest Thomas had made for her. Someday, perhaps, she'd give it to a child or grandchild, this physical record of how two people had built a life from fragments and determination. But for now, it was theirs, a reminder of how far they'd come. December brought preparations for Christmas and the darkest days of the year. Evangeline had never particularly enjoyed winter, had always found the short days and long nights oppressive, but this year felt different. This year, the darkness was something to shelter against together, rather than endure alone. The church held a Christmas Eve service, and for the first time since the harvest gathering, Evangeline walked into town without Thomas needing to drive the wagon. She insisted on walking the 2 miles, taking frequent rests, leaning heavily on her cane, but determined to make the journey on her own power. Thomas walked beside her, matching her pace without complaint, Daniel ranging ahead and circling back like an eager puppy. The road was frozen hard, easier to navigate than mud would have been, and the cold air made Evangeline's breath visible in clouds. Every step hurt, but it was a manageable hurt, one she'd learned to work with rather than fight against. "You don't have to prove anything," Thomas said gently as they paused for her to rest about halfway to town. "I'm not proving anything," Evangeline replied. "I just want to walk into that church on Christmas Eve. Want to feel like I can still do hard things when they matter." Thomas studied her face in the fading afternoon light. "You do hard things every day. Walking to church is just one more." But it mattered to Evangeline in ways she couldn't fully explain. 7 months ago, she'd walked 60 miles and destroyed herself in the process. Now she was walking 2 miles and would finish without permanent damage. It was a different kind of triumph, quieter and less dramatic, but triumph nonetheless. Proof that she could still push herself, still achieve difficult goals, just on a different scale than before. They reached the church as the sun set, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold. Inside, candles flickered on every surface, and the smell of pine boughs filled the air. People greeted them warmly, making space on a pew, asking after Evangeline's health and her work. She'd become part of the fabric of this community, woven in through dozens of small interactions and shared moments. The service was simple and beautiful. Reverend Peters spoke about journeys and homecomings, about the Holy Family finding shelter in unexpected places, about how the divine often showed up in ordinary moments rather than grand miracles. Evangeline found herself crying quietly, not from sadness but from a fullness of emotion she couldn't quite name. Thomas's hand found hers in the dimness, squeezing gently. On her other side, Daniel sat unusually still, absorbed in the Reverend's words. Around them, their neighbors sang carols, in voices rough and untrained, but full of genuine feeling. And Evangeline understood, perhaps for the first time fully, what it meant to belong somewhere. After the service, people lingered in the churchyard despite the cold, sharing conversation and small gifts. Helen Bradshaw gave Evangeline a jar of preserved peaches in thanks for letting out her dresses. Mr. Grayson presented her with a beautifully carved needle case, explaining that his late wife had owned one similar, and he thought Evangeline should have it. Sarah Fletcher handed over a somewhat lumpy knitted scarf she'd made herself, blushing as she admitted it was her first attempt. Evangeline accepted each gift with genuine gratitude, understanding that these weren't just objects, but symbols of acceptance, evidence that she'd found a place in this community. She'd walked into Copper Falls as a stranger, broken and uncertain, and somehow, over the course of these months, she'd become one of them. The walk home took longer than the walk there, Evangeline's foot protesting the extended use. But she made it, step by careful step, and when they finally reached the house, she felt a sense of accomplishment that rivaled anything she'd felt during the original 60-mile journey. "I'm proud of you," Thomas said, as he helped her inside and settled her in the rocking chair by the fire. "But promise me you won't push that hard again, without telling me first. I was worried you'd wear yourself out completely." "I promise," Evangeline said, meaning it. She'd learned the difference between pushing herself to grow and pushing herself to destruction. The line between the two was thinner than she'd once thought, and required constant attention to maintain. Winter deepened, the days short and cold, but the house stayed warm and full of life. Sarah began her apprenticeship after Christmas, coming 3 days a week to learn proper sewing techniques. She proved to be a quick study, her young hands already skilled from years of helping her mother. More importantly, she brought energy and conversation that made the work feel lighter. Through Sarah, Evangeline learned more about the community she'd joined. Who was courting whom, which families were struggling financially, who needed help but was too proud to ask for it. Armed with this knowledge, Evangeline found subtle ways to help. She'd offer to trade sewing work for goods rather than money when she knew someone couldn't afford to pay. She'd create extra baked goods and send them home with Sarah for families who needed them. She'd discovered that being part of a community meant looking out for each other, and she took that responsibility seriously. In February, Daniel received a letter from the regional school board offering him a position as a teacher's assistant in a town 30 miles north. It was an opportunity he'd been hoping for, a chance to pursue his dreams of education, but accepting it meant leaving Thomas and Evangeline, striking out on his own for the first time. The night he told them, there was a heaviness in the house that had nothing to do with winter weather. Daniel was both excited and terrified, eager for independence but afraid of abandoning his brother who'd sacrificed so much for him. "You should go," Thomas said firmly, before Daniel could even finish explaining his concerns. "This is what we've been working toward, you having opportunities, building your own life. But you need help with the sawmill, with the house." "We'll manage," Thomas interrupted. "Evangeline and I are a team now. We'll figure it out together." Daniel looked to Evangeline, seeking her agreement. She smiled at him, this boy who'd become her brother over the past months. "Your brother's right. This is your chance to chase something you want. Don't let worry about us hold you back." "You'll visit," Daniel said, making it both a question and demand. "Both of you, you'll come see me, make sure I'm doing all right?" "Of course," Evangeline promised, "though something tells me you'll do more than all right." Daniel left in early March, when the worst of winter had passed, but spring hadn't yet arrived. They stood in the yard, the three of them, and there were tears and fierce hugs and promises to write often. Then Daniel climbed into the wagon that would take him to his new life, and Thomas and Evangeline watched until it disappeared around the bend in the road. "The house is going to feel empty," Thomas said quietly. "For a while," Evangeline agreed. "But he needs to go build his own story now, just like we're building ours." They walked back inside together, and the house did feel empty, Daniel's absence a palpable presence. But over the following days, they adjusted, found new rhythms, new ways of dividing responsibilities, discovered that they enjoyed the privacy of being just the two of them, the freedom to shape their days without considering a third person's needs. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it was glorious. The valley exploded in wildflowers, and the river ran high with snowmelt. Thomas planted a garden 3 times the size of the previous year, knowing Evangeline wanted to try her hand at growing herbs and vegetables. She could kneel if she was careful, could work the soil with her hands, even if she couldn't stand for long periods. One warm afternoon in May, nearly 8 months after her arrival in Copper Falls, Evangeline walked to the ridge where she'd first seen the town, the same ridge where she'd sat, exhausted and in agony, looking down at her destination with hope and desperation warring in her chest. The walk took her most of the afternoon, with frequent rests and careful navigation of the steep sections. Thomas had wanted to come with her, but she'd asked to go alone. This was something she needed to do for herself, a journey to close a circle. She stood on that ridge as the sun began its descent, looking down at Copper Falls spread out in the valley below. She could see the church steeple, the sawmill, the river winding through town. Somewhere down there was her house, the home she shared with Thomas, the life they'd built together. 8 months ago, she'd stood here broken and afraid, her foot ruined and her future uncertain. She'd been so focused on what she'd lost, on how she'd failed to complete the journey alone, that she'd almost missed what she'd found. A partner willing to carry her when she couldn't walk, a community willing to welcome her as she was, a new understanding of what strength truly meant. Her foot still hurt. It would always hurt, the doctor had told her. A permanent reminder of the journey she'd undertaken. She'd never walk without pain again, never move with the ease she'd once possessed. But she'd learned to see that pain as part of her story rather than the whole of it. She was more than her injury, more than her limitation, more than the sum of the things she couldn't do. She was a woman who'd walked 60 miles for love, who'd learned to accept help, who'd built a business and a reputation and a home, who'd become part of a community, who'd discovered that the truest measure of strength was not in refusing to break, but in how you rebuilt yourself afterward. The sun touched the western peaks, flooding the valley with golden light. Evangeline pulled out the compass Thomas had given her all those months ago, the one with their initials scratched into the brass. She didn't need it to find her way anymore. She knew these mountains now, knew the path home, but she held it anyway, feeling its familiar weight in her palm, remembering the girl who'd carried it as a talisman through impossible distances. That girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who'd learned that some journeys change you in ways you can't anticipate, that the destination is never quite what you imagined, and that sometimes the truest victories come not from completing the journey alone, but from learning when to let someone help you finish it. As the last light faded from the sky, Evangeline turned and began the careful walk home. Her cane tapped a steady rhythm against the earth. Her foot ached with each step, but she was walking toward love, toward partnership, toward a life richer than any she could have built alone. The house lights were visible long before she reached it, warm and welcoming in the gathering dusk. Thomas would be watching for her, probably worried, despite her assurances she'd be fine. She'd let him fuss a little, enjoy his relief at her safe return, then tell him about standing on that ridge and finally making peace with all of it, the walk and the failure and the triumph and the transformation. Because that's what they did now. They told each other things. They carried each other's burdens. They built a life together, one careful step at a time. Evangeline had walked 60 miles to marry Thomas Ashford, but the real journey had been everything that came after. The learning to heal, the accepting of help, the building of community, the discovery that love wasn't about being perfect but about being honest. That journey wasn't measured in miles but in moments, in shared sunsets and quiet evenings and the daily choice to keep building something together. She reached the house as full dark settled over the valley. Thomas opened the door before she could knock, pulling her inside with gentle urgency, asking if she was all right. Had she pushed too hard? Did she need anything? "I'm fine," Evangeline assured him, letting him help her to the chair by the fire. "Better than fine. I'm home." And she was, not just in this house, not just in this town, but in this life they'd created together. A life built from broken pieces and stubborn determination and the radical choice to let someone carry you when the path grew too steep to walk alone. Outside, the stars emerged one by one, mapping the sky in familiar patterns. Inside, lamplight glowed warm against the darkness, and two people who'd found each other across impossible distances settled into the comfortable silence of being home. The walk was over, the story continued, and every step, painful and triumphant and perfectly imperfect, had been worth it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.